All right, guys, we're back at it again. Joe the Fan here with Just Win Bets Baby with Shane O'Mac and, of course, our guest, the Ace of Diamonds, Adam. You can get him on X follow him at Ace of Diamonds on X. Hot news coming out of MLB, Adam, of course, from the Washington Nationals, the firing of the GM, Mike Rizzo, and of course their skipper. Your thoughts on the news?
Yeah, so I think honestly, I'm all kind of for both moves. Let's first of all start with Davey Martinez. Now, of course, he was extended, I believe, like a year or two after they won World Series back in 19. And of course, it's kind of been a stalled rebuild. I don't think he's done too great of a job there. I feel like he's contributed a lot to those, losing seasons. Never consistently bottom of a league. I feel like, certainly a lot of maybe his coaching, certainly certain aspects of that wasn't the best. So the Nats need to change that. That's something that Nationals owner Mark Lerner said, was that they need a fresh approach and, energy that's going to revitalize that clubhouse. Need someone who's more of a newer mind in the game, maybe someone who's a little bit more analytically minded, which, I can also kind of later talk about Mike Rizzo in just a minute here. And so I think overall, just in terms of a direction you're going in, I like the firing. And I think, seeing the reaction from a lot of Nats fans, they were very pleased about it. And that, I think this is definitely good for Nats fans. It's definitely something to be excited about. One of the few things that you can probably be excited about, the last few years, besides all the losing, of course. Now, in terms of Mike Rizzo, now I originally said on X that, it was a bit surprising that he got fired. I think considering that, I first thought about it, I was like, okay, well, he's made some decent trades. The Soto trades worked out really well. Wood, Abrams, and Mackenzie Gore, have all become all-stars. Gore and Wood this year having fantastic seasons. Abrams, an all-star last year. And, the Soto trades panned out well for them so far. But overall, Rizzo, ever since 2019, he hasn't done really that great of a job. Now, not all of it is to blame on him, because Lerner and, the rest of the Nats ownership group, they're not letting him spend. And I think that's part of the reason to blame why they're not, really able to be competitive. You see other teams, paying other players to, try to be competitive. And, they've been more than up there. Look at what the Rangers have done. And, there's a few other teams out there. But, I feel like the Nationals kind of fall in the same area as maybe a team like the Pirates or the Orioles, a team, two teams that, recently haven't been able, or who just don't want to spend a lot of money. Especially more Pirates with Paul Skeens. He's a generational pitcher. And one of the, possibly one of the greatest pitchers we've seen in recent history. And so they don't want to build, around him because, again, they just don't want to spend money. I know in the offseason, a lot of Pirates fans were very pissed off about that. And so that leads to is, the national, and that's why, I say that, it's not all of Rizzo's fault again. But I do think there should be some leeway for him to be blamed. That, again, he's also part to blame for the stalled rebuild. I think more so from a perception that, there's not been a lot of good player development and a lot of good drafting. And, they get number one picks a lot. They have a number one pick this year. But overall, they haven't really developed a lot of prospects, maybe outside of, the Soto trade and, maybe, a couple players in the Scherzer trade possibly. But, not really, but from an overall perspective, it's not really helped them a lot. There's been a lot of prospects that haven't worked out for them. And so I think with that, kind of an old school, maybe a little too old school. And I think, again, the Nationals, if they talk about fresh energy, I think, bringing in new faces and, kind of needing a new analytical approach, which is what everyone goes by these days on baseball and all sports, as you guys know. And so, I'm more on the side of, just all for a firing of Rizzo for that reason. And, and I don't really know, who knows if, they're going to really, invest more in a team and spend more money, regardless of who their next GM, who their next manager is. That very well could not change, in my opinion. And, probably won't. But, and, it's still, I like both the moves, to be certain. And, in terms of, I know the one concern was that, you're firing both of them a week prior to the draft, especially considering the fact that the Nats have the number 1 overall pick. And, I'm not too, in terms of just the draft alone, I'm not too concerned about it because they do have a number 1 pick. And I think the number 1 pick, it is, just a situation where the decision is a little bit more straightforward now. For most of the mock drafts and for most of the news I've read online, it seems like the Nationals either choose Ethan Holiday, the high schooler that's coming out, son of Matt Holliday, former MLB star, brother of Jackson Holliday, top prospect for the Orioles. He's one of the, he's great. He might be generational. And also a LSU pitcher, a Cade Anderson. Now I hear more so it's going to be Anderson because they have, maybe outside Mackenzie Gore, maybe a couple other guys, they haven't really had a lot of good pitching depth. So really it's going to, I think for most people, number 1, when it comes to that number 1 pick, if it was any other team, it would probably come down to either one of those 2 guys. I think, and I think, Anderson for the Nationals, it's a pretty straightforward pick there, in my opinion. And I don't really see a lot of damage being caused there in terms of a firing when it comes to picking that first guy in a draft this year.
You mentioned pitching there, Adam. Of course, love the pitching lately from the Detroit Tigers. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. Shano, let's bring you in here with, of course, the firing of Ramirez and Rizzo. Yeah, it's a week before the draft. Adam explained that. But do you feel, and this is what I've read a lot as well, do you feel, Shano, that the game has passed Rizzo, where it's gotten, a little bit more, it's not like it used to be. And that's the reason. And I feel like it was a combination. It wasn't just like, hey, look, you just get rid of the manager and keep the GM. It was a package deal. I think it was both the GM and the manager gone. What say you there, Shana?
I'm all for the firing of Davey Martinez. I thought he should have been gone last season. The team is if they've had so many simple mistakes that I think are more coaching mistakes than they are anything else. Like, for example, this year, I can't count how many times I've seen them make errors on the base paths, like when they're running around the bases. Mm-hmm. And it's all, I think that's more coaching than anything. And that's like, it goes up to even the first base coach and third base coach telling them when to go and when to stop. They've been, I've seen them stop on third base more than any other team when they should be sending them home. I'm like, what are you doing? Get the run, get in there. So Davey, I felt like should have been gone a while ago. So that's fine. But I thought they would probably have kept him because his contract's up at the end of this year anyways. But no harm, no foul, whatever. Rizzo, I'm still a little shocked by that. But if the learners aren't going to want to spend money, Rizzo is not the GM for you. Right. Rizzo's best at trades and bringing in free agents that when he was capable of spending money when they gave him the budget in like 2017, 2018, 2019 when they won the World Series, he was a hell of a GM. He brought in a lot of great talent. He got the team to a high caliber place for a very long time, for five plus years. But that's when the learners had the checkbook and were actually paying people. And then now they tightened up the purse strings, and he doesn't have that money anymore. And he's not that type of GM where he has these high caliber drafts. He's more of a trade and sign guy. So if you're not going to want to spend money, he's not the GM for you. So.
I agree with that. I mean, he had Rendon, he had Trey Turner. Of course, they were playing for different clubs. One playing for the Angels, and the other one playing, of course, for the Philadelphia Phillies. Turner is. Adam, back to you here. So, yeah, Rizzo was known as a farm guy. You know, he did that in Atlanta, as you know there, Adam. But what I still think it was a package deal where, hey, look, you got rid of both for the price of one, start over. I don't think he developed in the farm lately. You do get Wood, you know, you got some great prospects and young guys there, but you know, they picked up a guy from the Pirates a couple seasons ago. That didn't pan out. So what would you have done in Rizzo's case with all those draft picks, with the limited amount of money? It feels like they went, I know they're no longer the Oakland Athletics, but it looks like he's Billy Bean here.
Yeah, I can completely get what that's saying. You know, I certainly, you know, again, going back to, you know, kind of that new, you know, you kind of need a new school approach. You know, I would just, you know, probably reassess my whole analytic department, my whole scouting department. And, you know, like you said, he's a farm guy, you know, and if he's going to live and die by the farm, and if he's going to live and die by signings, and, you know, if ownership is not going to allow him to spend, you know, the type of money to go out and, you know, keep someone like Bryce Harper, now, albeit they won a World Series without him, or, you know, just sign any, you know, big name free agent out there, you know, to a mega deal that's going to break records in the sport, then, you know, then I'm going to invest more, you know, with farm. I'm going to be more like the Tampa Bay Rays, you know, be low payroll, but still have great player development and have great, you know, scouting department, great executives within the player development as well. And so I would reassess all of that and see, hey, what can I do, kind of, you know, not just get a mix of new school, but also a mix of old school guys, and try to find guys who are gonna help me build through a farm and help me build a solid core to try to get back to, you know, those years where we saw in 2010s where they were just pretty much competitive every year from pretty much 2012 to 2019. And, you know, 2019, that was the last year that you could probably really feel that they were competitive, because, again, they, you know, won a World Series. And ever since then, it's, it's just been a torture in DC.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's torture in the sense of they got shellacked against a very poor baseball team this past weekend against the Colorado Rockies. I have to agree with you there, Adam. Shano, what say you? Any more? Would you like to add a little bit more wood to the fire here?
I just have one thing to say. Did you guys see Rizzo's statement where he said, I navigated that ownership group for almost 20 years?
No.
I did not.
It sounds to me like he was not the learner, like he's not big fans of the learners to start off with.
Wow.
Just the way he said that, and that was like his official statement. He's like, I navigated that ownership group for almost 20 years. I was like, it just blew my mind. That like shows me that like maybe there was something else more in play here too, that like they just didn't get along with each other, and then finally he did something and it just snapped, and then they just were like, all right, we're tired of dealing with this dude. He's been here for a long time. Let's make a change.
Yeah. No love lost there, apparently, based on the reports that you're reading there, Shano. But yeah, I mean, it went from division champs, pennant winner, World Series winner. I even have the hat there, my friend. Okay, but I don't even. The last few seasons, it's just been complete garbage. Let's move on. Of course, Adam, before we let you go, the Dodgers seem to be struggling lately. They're struggling now with the Brewers tonight. They don't seem like the Dodgers of before, but the 8-0, they won their last 8 games. Of course, I'm talking about the Jays, the Blue Jays of Toronto. They've been on fire. I mentioned also Detroit's pitching. I love their pitching. I think they've done a hell of a job. I know you and Shano picked Detroit to win the most wins in July. And then your launch out, of course, being St. Louis Cardinals. My Mariners are still in the hunt, but what do you say here when it comes to the Cubbies, to the Detroit Tigers, and what's the deal going on with the Tigers? Excuse me, with the the Los Angeles Dodgers?
Well, I certainly think with the Dodgers, again, it's, you see, how many pitchers that they have, who sideline. Again, a lot of it has to do with the pitching issues. Now, despite the fact, the Dodgers, spend a lot of money, and like the Nationals, they sign, they have Ohtani and, Mookie Betts. Now, Ohtani, of course, not with all the, referrals or, deferrals or whatever in later years, and he's getting all of his money through sponsorships or whatever it is. He's still paying money to Betts and, Blake Snell, Tyler Glasnow, and, those two former Rays pitchers, Glasnow and Snell. A lot of them are, have been injured, and a lot of the pitchers that they signed, such as, you mention it, Trinan, Evan Phillips, Kirby Yates, Roki Sasaki, who's been inconsistent, when healthy. A lot of their pitchers have struggled, and I think their ERA is actually one of the higher ones in the league this year. Now, they're still, albeit they're still doing very well because they always sign pitching depth because, there's always the old adages that you never have enough pitching, and pitchers just get injured and drop like flies these days because everyone just throws so hard and everyone just puts so much stress on their arm, when it comes to spin rate and, just chasing velocity. That's just how the game is these days. And, there's also been some, inconsistent offensive numbers on the road. And I think in a couple of areas that they could, improve their offense. And so, but I think mainly more it's been, they've kind of been unlucky with the injuries. A lot of pitchers just, getting hurt. A lot of them, some of them are on a more aging side or who have had an extensive injury history in their career.
Sure.
So I think that's, a large part of why they've been struggling so much lately. But I wouldn't say, they're still in a bad spot. They're 21 games over 500. They're still, I believe, leaving the National League West. I think they're still in a close battle for Padres and the Giants as well. But, I still think the Dodgers, since they still have, a lot of depth, they always aim to, have that depth, and they still seem to be in a really good spot overall, though. I think they still have enough, despite those problems. They prepare for that well. I still think, they're, it's not really much to worry about right now. Even though they've been losing a bit more than you'd like to see them lose lately. Dodgers fans want to win a lot more.
Sure. With the Blue Jays, who's on the verge of winning their 9th straight, they're currently up 8-3 against the White Sox. They're visiting, of course, the Chicago White Sox. The other bad team, my last question would be the other bad team that we've noticed besides the Washington Nationals. I mean, we just call it like we see it there, Adam. But it's, of course, the Pittsburgh Pirates. We mentioned the Colorado Rockies, of course. But, of course, the Pirates. And what about the Guardians? Guardians got to be, who are currently tied with the Astros right now, 4-4, heading into the top of the 6th there. Are the Guardians and the Pirates or the Nationals, let alone the Colorado Rockies, who's been bad for quite some time now, which one of those 4 teams will get out to kind of turn around a 180? Do you think will happen? Which one of those 4 teams will turn around?
I think most likely it'll be that's pretty easy one. I think it'll be most likely the Cleveland Guardians. The Rockies have a worse record in baseball by far. They're not going anywhere this year, nor anytime soon. By far, they might break the single season record that was, broken by the White Sox last year for most losses in the season. With they had 120. The White Sox did last year. The Nationals is still going to take time. I think they're too much being 6 feet under right now for any chances of them, making a run this season. They just don't have enough talent to do it. And so does the Pirates. Again, with Pirates, they're going to have to make a lot of moves to try to build around Skeens and, whoever else, O'Neal Cruz and some of those younger starts that they have on that team. And so, I think, Cleveland, Cleveland's been struggling a bit this year. But I think they're, the most likely to, I would say, if you want to say turnaround, they would be the ones to most likely do so. And they're kind of always a team that's kind of always in the hunt. I mean, yeah, they're sitting at 40 and 48. You know, I still feel like, you know, maybe there's a slight chance that they could get out to more of a run. I think what they do need maybe a bit more of is the offense. I think the offense is, again, you know, kind of a problem for them this year. You know, they trade away Josh Naylor to the Diamondbacks, who has been one of their big offensive players the last few years. You know, he's an all-star last year. They need him to do better. And yeah, their offense is not great outside of Jose Ramirez and Steven Kwan. Everyone else is, you know, OPS plus wise a low average hitter. So, you know, you're hoping, you know, hopefully some of their offense will turn around. You're hoping that, you know, Kyle Manzardo, top prospect, do better. Gabriel Arias do something. Bo Naylor do something. You know, some of their younger guys. And you know, their pitching is still, you know, solid enough. You know, Clase, you know, got off to a slow start of the year, but he's been good. You know, guys like Jake Junis, Kate Smith, Hunter Gaddis, Tim Herron. You know, Colby Allard's been great for him. Joey Cantillo's been great for him. You know, in some innings. You know, I would say, you know, if the, you know, Guardians need anything, they do have more of the offense, but I think they definitely have most going for them is that pitching staff, especially in that bullpen. I think, you know, maybe the, you know, one or two starts turn around. Maybe they acquire start for deadline for talking a few weeks from now that, you know, they're going to be good. But, you know, I still feel like they have more pitching going for them than those other three teams. They're, you know, in the best position right now, but I still feel like, you know, honestly, I don't think they're going to make playoffs either, but, you know, just because of the offense, there's too many holes in offense outside of Ramirez and Kwan. But, you know, I still feel like, you know, again, just where they are sitting record-wise and just with the talent that they have, you know, again, especially that pitching, that's going to help them out a lot, you know, if they are to make a run.
Well, we appreciate, Adam, that you coming on the show here on talking about, of course, the recent firing of both the manager and the GM of the Washington Nationals. Where do they go from here? Who knows? Guys, don't forget to leave a comment about this shocking news that just came to us. Again, if you want to follow Adam, the Ace of Diamonds, you can see him on X at Ace of Diamonds. He does all of our MLB picks. He's been doing very well. I don't want to jinx it for him, but he's been going either 2-0, 1-1 the last couple weeks. So he's going to continue doing that for us for the remainder of the MLB season as the All-Star game is approaching relatively soon. Again, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, that thumbs up that tells us how we're doing and helps us out on this channel. Don't forget to hit that bell that tells you when we have a new video that comes out. For Shane O'Mac and Adam, I'm Joe the Fan, and we will definitely catch you next time.